Hello and welcome to the Novel Analyst Podcast. I'm Jed Hearn, and every episode I analyze a story to help you become a better writer. This episode is titled The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. Finding Your Perfect Prose. Super quick announcement before we get into this show. If you go onto Goodreads and search up my name, Jed Hearn, and you choose to follow me, you can see all the reviews that I leave for books I read. I'm making an effort this year to write a quick paragraph review of every book as I finish reading it, with like a star rating and, kind of some lessons that I take from that. So if you enjoy these episodes where I analyze stories, you might like those. And reading those reviews might give you a hint as to what books I'm going to do on the podcast in the future. So now, into the episode. The Great Gatsby is a 1920s novel by F. Scott Fitzgerald, widely regarded as one of the best American pieces of literature of all time. It's definitely one of my favorite books. I read it in Year 12 literature originally, and I've probably read it maybe 5 to 6 times, I would say, since then. And it's basically this, essentially, tragedy slash love story about this enigmatic figure called Gatsby and his attempt to win the love of this woman he can never have, set in 1920s New York, amongst the glitz and glamour of the jazz age and the roaring 20s. This episode is going to contain very minor spoilers. I'm mainly focusing on the prose for it, as you can probably have told by the title, so I probably won't spoil too many plot-related things, but if you haven't read the book and you do want to read it, then come back to this episode after you've had a read. So, in this episode, I want to look at one of the perhaps strongest elements of The Great Gatsby, and one of the elements that is a real joy to come back to with each successive reread, and that is the prose. So prose is the language that a story is written in. It's the words of the narration and stuff. So if you say in a book, Bob walked down the hill, that's prose, right? It's different to poetry, which is where it's words written to some sort of rhyming or some sort of, regular meter or whatever. Prose is just kind of the everyday language that we speak in, that we think in. Unless you think in poetry, in which case that's kind of disturbing. So in The Great Gatsby, the prose is amazing, and I'm going to read a couple of extracts from the novel and analyze why the prose is amazing and how come it's amazing and how you can kind of adopt the same techniques in your writing. And then I'm going to kind of bring it back to a wider point about what makes good prose in general. So the first extract comes from the first chapter of the novel. I'll get into it here. Quote, we walked through stuffed it up already. Quote, we walked through a high hallway into a bright rose-colored space, fragilely bound into the house by French windows at either end. The windows were ajar and gleaming white against the fresh grass outside that seemed to grow a little way into the house. A breeze blew through the room, blew curtains in at one end and out the other like pale flags, twisting them up towards the frosted wedding cake of the ceiling, and then rippled over the wine-colored rug, making a shadow on it as wind does on the sea. The only completely stationary object in the room was an enormous couch, on which 2 young women were buoyed up as though upon an anchored balloon. They were both in white, and their dresses were rippling and fluttering as if they had just been blown back in after a short flight around the house. I must have stood for a few moments listening to the whip and snap of the curtains, and the groan of a pitcher on the wall. Then there was a boom as Tom Buchanan shut the rear windows, and the court wind died out about the room, and the curtains and the rugs and the 2 young women ballooned slowly to the floor. End quote. So that stuff's amazing. And if you look at the copy of my novel, which I'm reading at the moment, it's got annotations scrawled all over it because there is just so much great stuff in that 2 paragraphs that I just read out now. But what makes it so good? What makes it so lyrical and so rhythmic and so almost hypnotic as you read it? It's just setting description. It's not really moving the plot forward that much. It's not really got any interesting conflict in it or any interesting dialogue in it or anything. It's just an author describing a room, but it's still compelling. Well, I think a lot of it comes to the variation in sentence starts. And this sounds like a really banal thing, but bear with me. So if I have a paragraph and it goes like this: the person did a thing, the person then did this other thing, the person finished by doing this last thing, you're going to go to sleep pretty quickly, right? Because it's just repetition. It's just the same thing over and over again. That was kind of ironic. I didn't mean to do that. But if you look at this extract, the sentences all start differently. So the first sentence starts with the word we, second sentence the, third sentence a, next sentence the, next sentence they, next sentence I, last sentence then. So some of those are kind of similar. The and they are pretty similar. But in the most part, all the sentences kind of start off differently. And this variation is important to creating this kind of different rhythm to it, right? This is one of the things I think about when I'm speaking and making these episodes. If I was just monotone and I had the same voice all the way through, it would probably be super boring. But if I vary things up, I go from, high-pitched stuff to more low-pitched things for serious points, it's more interesting and it's more engaging for you to listen to. It's the same deal with your prose. If you have repetition, whether that is in how the sentences start or more commonly in how long the sentences are, if they start all the same way, if they're all the same length, it's just going to dissolve into this kind of mushy porridge of badness, and it's not going to be very engaging to read. Now, there's a couple of other things with this extract as well, which make it, in my opinion, a fantastic piece of prose. But I actually want to look at some other extracts because the patterns will become more clear as I go through them. And it's going to be more useful for you that way. So let's flip to the next extract from the novel, which is a little bit further on, the start of chapter 3. And this, just to give you some context, is kind of descriptions of Gatsby's parties, which are very glitzy, very glamorous, hundreds of people there, massive affairs, kind of very emblematic of the roaring 20s and the jazz age in 1920s New York. So here is the beginning of the chapter. And I think it's crucial to remember that this is the start of a chapter, so it really does have to do a lot of heavy lifting in terms of setting the scene, which it achieves super well. Let's go. Quote, "There was music from my neighbor's house through the summer nights. In his blue gardens, men and girls came and went like moths among the whisperings and the champagne and the stars. At high tide in the afternoon, I watched his guests diving from the tower of his raft, or taking the sun on the hot sand of his beach, while his 2 motorboats slit the waters of the Sound, drawing aquaplanes over cataracts of foam. On weekends, his Rolls-Royce became an omnibus, bearing parties to and from the city between 9 in the morning and long past midnight, while his station wagon scampered like a brisk yellow bug to meet all trains. And on Mondays, 8 servants, including an extra gardener, toiled all day with mops and scrubbing brushes and hammers and garden shears, repairing the ravages of the night before." End quote. Again, another beautiful piece of descriptive language here. Again, it's not really sort of setting up any conflict, it's just establishing the scene. And more importantly than just establishing kind of the physical layout of the things that are in Gatsby's place, it's establishing the tone of the chapter. It's sort of very, lyrical, and it's very sort of glamorous. There's almost like an amorphous quality to it. You have this whole idea of the blue gardens and the people floating in and out of the gardens like moths. It's quite an interesting description. And one of the things that I'd noticed when I was reading this, which is a technique I've kind of stolen in my own writing a lot, a technique that I particularly love, is the use of syndetic listing. So traditional listing is where you just use commas to separate things. So you're like, I had a banana, comma, an apple, comma, and a potato, full stop. With syndetic listing, you're using conjunctions like and to join the different items within your list. So in these 2 fragments I've just read to you, there are 3 big instances of syndetic listing being used to establish this kind of really nice pacing and rhythm and tone to it. So the first one, if we jump back to the first extract, is the last sentence of that. Quote, "Then there was a boom as Tom Buchanan shut the rear window and the court wind died out about the room, and the curtains and the rugs and the 2 young women ballooned slowly to the floor." So there's syndetic listing here because instead of saying the curtains, the rugs, and the 2 young women ballooned slowly to the floor, it's the curtains and the rugs and the 2 young women ballooned slowly to the floor. And it creates for me a far more interesting rhythmical tone and kind of this better sense of pacing and finality to how it ends. And again, if we go to the second extract, there is another instance of syndetic listing here. So let's look at the second sentence of this extract. Quote, "In his blue gardens, men and girls came and went like moths amongst the whisperings and the champagne and the stars." End quote. So there's about, what's that, 1, 2, 3, 4 uses of the word "and," where some of those probably could have been commas, and maybe in a more traditional, conventional story, they would have been commas. But by having them as "and," it sort of just flows you through the sentence way quicker. It just carries you along this conveyor belt. And again, the last sentence of this particular extract here, quote, "And on Mondays, 8 servants, including an extra gardener, toiled all day with mops and scrubbing brushes and hammers and garden shears, repairing the ravages of the night before." Here, the kind of syndetic listing creates this almost exhaustive tone to how much stuff is going on here. You're like, there's this thing, and there's this thing, and there's this thing, and there's this thing. How big is this party? So that's a really interesting way of using kind of a different listing method to create a sense of tone and reflect your story's thematic ideas. For me personally, in my writing, I really love using syndetic listing, and this is not a technique I can claim credit for. You know, obviously I've copied it from here, as I've just realized, and I've seen it in many other novels, but I love using syndetic listing in fight scenes in particular. You have characters like, and they grappled and they fought and they like punched each other and they rolled down the hill and kept kicking and biting and screaming and rolling and punching, and that was probably not a very good example, but by just kind of joining everything together and mashing it up with all these conjunctions, all these ands, you create this really frenetic, fast-paced tone. And this is a technique I've seen just off the top of my head in The Silhouette and the Sacrifice, third Boone Shepherd book by Gabriel Bergmoser, which I did an episode on earlier. I've seen it in Skullduggery Pleasant books, which I think is where I actually stole the technique from in the first place. And it's just a really cool way of using different types of prose to establish pacing. So let's move on to the third main extract that I've taken out of this book. And I mean, really, you can pretty much draw any quote out of this book and it's going to sound amazing. This is definitely a book which has withstood the test of time. Can't believe it's almost 100 years old, actually. It was published in 1925, I believe. So here is the third extract, and the last extract I'm going to read from Gatsby before I move on to more universal techniques for creating amazing prose. Quote, "No telephone message arrived, but the butler went without his sleep and waited for it until 4 o'clock, until long after there was anyone to give it to if it came. I have an idea that Gatsby himself didn't believe it would come, and perhaps he no longer cared. If that was true, he must have felt that he had lost the old warm world, paid a high price for living too long with a single dream. He must have looked up at an unfamiliar sky through frightening leaves and shivered as he found what a grotesque thing a rose is, and how raw the sunlight was upon the scarcely created grass. A new world, material without being real, where poor ghosts, breathing dreams like air, drifted fortuitously about, like that ashen, fantastic figure, gliding towards him through the amorphous trees." End quote. Again, there's this beautiful dream-like quality to the prose here, which is one of the probably biggest reasons why I enjoy this novel so much. A lot of the novels I read, the prose is kind of what George Orwell called window pane prose, which is just, it's just there to get the story across, right? Like, it's not supposed to distract you, it's just supposed to be clear and let you through. Whereas Gatsby stuff is more stained glass prose rather, where the appreciation of the lens through which you are seeing the story is almost as important as the story itself. Now, what makes this passage particularly important? Well, I think, again, it really reinforces how important it is to start your sentences in different ways. If we look at the ways that this is started, the first sentence begins with no, then the second sentence is I, next sentence is if, then it's he, and then it's a. So those are all very different ways of starting it, and that kind of breaks it up, that kind of gives it this different rhythm. Again, we see the use of syndetic listing here, through frightening leaves and shivered as he found what a grotesque thing a rose is and how raw the sunlight was upon the scarcely created grass. Actually, that's not really syndetic listing, but something interesting is going on with that part, with that quote there in particular. There's this sense of rhythm to it, unfamiliar sky through frightening leaves and shivered as he found what a grotesque thing a rose is and how raw the sunlight was upon the scarcely created grass. This is not something that I really fully understand myself how to create. So, I can't really break down and analyze specifically what makes this so lyrical. But I think part of it would have to be kind of the multiple descriptions here. And if this sounds unprepared, it's because it is. I'm just looking at a book I love and trying to work out why it's so cool. If you think about scarcely created, grass, kind of those two adjectives outside of grass, scarcely created. Is scarcely an adjective or is that an adverb? Oh well, either way, those two kind of descriptive words outside of grass sort of create a very defined pace for it. If it was just upon the new grass, it's not very interesting, but scarcely created grass, scarcely, to what's the word? 2 syllables there. Created, 3 syllables. Scarcely created grass. That's a lot more kind of effort to get through there. It's creating this cool kind of rhythm and pacing. But I think what this, got a bit sidetracked there trying to analyze something that was a bit above my current knowledge. One of the things that this extract does really well is this whole use of original, unusual adjectives that are attached to words in a way that kind of transport readers outside of the normal associations they have with that word. So what do I mean by that? Well, let's look at example here. Unfamiliar sky. Unfamiliar sky. Unfamiliar is the adjective in that case. It's creating a very different relation to the sky. We probably don't really think unfamiliar sky that much. Next one here is frightening leaves. How can leaves be frightening? It's almost a bit of a personification with it. And it's just creating this strong sense of emotion, right? Like unfamiliar, that's sort of creating a very definitive emotion about perhaps loneliness, perhaps being in a different place, perhaps realizing that you're not where you thought you were. Frightening leaves, it's sort of coming back to that idea of this sort of scaredness that you can get by being in this unfamiliar location, the sort of horror of, I suppose, untamed nature in this instance. And you can see this sort of attachment of unusual adjectives to words all throughout the novel. Earlier on in the second extract I read, he mentions his blue gardens. You wouldn't normally think of gardens as being blue. You would think of them as perhaps being green. But by describing them as blue gardens, it's sort of reflecting this almost twilight, liminal state. The sun is setting, the sky is sort of this kind of navy dark blue as darkness comes in. It's a blue gardens. It's this unusual dreamlike space. So what you can see from the 3 extracts I've read here is that Fitzgerald is really a master when it comes to creating evocative prose. And again, coming back to that example, if you think of prose on a spectrum from being simple, clear, really easy to see through to get to the story in the vein of George Orwell 1984, there is another end to that spectrum, which this novel falls on, and that is kind of the call it purple prose if you want to call it that. I think that's kind of derogatory, and I don't think that's what this is here, but it's kind of that glass-stained window prose where the lens through which you're seeing the story is so beautiful that what's actually happening in the story almost doesn't matter as much as just sort of the glasses that you're seeing it through. So that's a useful spectrum to think about, that spectrum between kind of embellishment with your prose and clarity with your prose. But I think that that's sort of missing the point with what prose is about, because I think that great prose is ultimately about clarity, yes, but not in just the sense of using simple, small words that everybody understands. Great prose is about the clarity with which you communicate and the honesty with which you communicate your story's themes and your story's truth. So in order to understand this, I'm going to have to bring up an architecture example, and I actually wrote down the outline for this episode because some preconceptions and myths I had about architecture were shattered. So I always used to believe, and for context here, I'm an architecture student, so architecture is my jam. And I always used to believe that authenticity was a big deal and very important in architecture. So what I mean by that is that a building that's made by brick, so let's say your house is made from brick. I used to believe if it's made from brick, it should look like it's made from brick, right? If it's made from steel, it should look like it's made from steel. whatever kind of techniques that's being used to construct your house, or any other building for that matter, should be authentically displayed in the final product. If it's a timber house, I want to be able to see some wood in there, right? If it's made from stone, it better make me feel like I'm walking through a stone building. And I had this talk with the boss of this architecture place that I worked at, Steve Van Elst, in Vietnam, and I was talking about this idea of the importance of kind of authenticity and truth in architecture, and I was sort of, asking him what his thoughts were on that. And he said something that really changed my mind on this. What he said is that, yes, construction authenticity is a part of authentic architecture. There are times when it is appropriate for the end product, the end building, to reflect the way in which it was made. So there are times when it is appropriate for a house built with brick to be clearly identifiable as a brick house at the end. But he talked about something more important. He said yes, construction authenticity, that's great. It's good to have. However, there's something more important, and that is authenticity to your design idea. Authenticity to the theme. And this kind of blew my mind a bit, because we were talking about this one architect whose stuff is just crazy. Daniel Libeskind, you can look him up if you want. And I'd kind of had, I like Libeskind stuff. I've been in some of his buildings. Really cool architect. Amazing ways of thinking about architecture. But I'd always thought his buildings were kind of a little bit, I guess, fake, because they were just sort of crazy. They were really hard to understand how they were made, and that to me meant they weren't very authentic, because the kind of final result was not clearly reflective of the construction process that had made them, if that can kind of make sense. But Steve said that Libeskind stuff was really good because it's always authentic to his design idea, his design vision. And I think we can take that and export that back into writing here. So what Steve was kind of saying is that, yes, authenticity to the construction is important, but what's more important is being authentic to your idea. And that's the same deal with prose. It's not about having, necessarily the simplest, easiest to understand, lowest vocabulary prose out there. And it's not necessarily about having the cleverest, most purple, convoluted, evocative prose out there. It's about being honest and truthful to your story. If your story is calling for evocative prose, like The Great Gatsby does, then give it evocative prose. If it's calling for something simple, like 1984 kind of does, which is, famously very sort of simple in its vocabulary, but in a really good way, then give it that. It's not about just imposing a prose style on your story from outside. It's about finding the truth of your story and just being truthful with that. Stephen King, in his book On Writing, has a really good bit where he talks about it doesn't matter what you write about as long as it's true. That doesn't mean you can't write about magic or dragons or spaceships or all that cool stuff that I really love. It just means that there has to be some sort of emotional honesty to it. Your story has to be talking about something that is, a passion of yours, a strongly held belief of yours, kind of universal aspect of the human experience, something that just rings true and feels authentic. And then if you have that kernel, that grain of truth in it, it doesn't matter what kind of fantastical trappings you put around it. Truth is important there. And if you have that, everything flows from it. And this is why The Great Gatsby is just amazing with its prose, because Gatsby's truth, if you like, its sort of thematic principle, is that it's this chronicle of the glitz and glamour and excess of the Roaring Twenties and the Jazz Age. And its prose works because it's authentic to this truth. So this means that even though I have kind of analyzed some techniques that F. Scott Fitzgerald has used to create very evocative, lyrical, poetic prose, it's not about you copying it in your story. It's not necessarily about you copying it in your story. Sure, maybe if your story kind of has some similar concerns, some similar themes, it might be a good idea to study The Great Gatsby in more depth and sort of maybe take some inspiration from that. But it's not about copying it. It's about being truthful to your story's tone. The kind of emotion that you want to be conveying from that. So maybe your tone is lighthearted and whimsical, like the first Harry Potter book. Maybe your tone is really grim, like The Blade Itself by Joe Abercrombie. Maybe your tone is this kind of absurdist, wacky stuff, like The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, where Earth is demolished to make way for a kind of space highway by this other race. Maybe your tone is kind of, a bit sad and bittersweet, like Flowers for Algernon. Maybe your tone is mysterious. Maybe it's warm or it's cold, or it's serious or it's playful, or it's world-weary or it's amazed. It doesn't matter. All that matters is being honest. So I guess to kind of end this, I want to ironically say, after all that dissection of how to do good prose, it's not something that you really need to worry about too much. You don't need to worry about having perfect prose. Just tell the truth. Be honest with what your story is about. And this is something that will come. Maybe you don't get it with the first draft. Maybe you don't get it with the second draft or the third one or the fourth one. But, maybe by the fifth, you kind of understand what your story's about. You understand the themes you're writing about. And that lets you go back and fix up the prose so that it's more appropriate to the story. So just tell the truth with your prose. And be true. And be honest. And, think about the heart of your novel and write towards the honesty there and the kind of emotional, universal experience that you're capturing in there, whether that is this experience of kind of glamour and, glitz of the Roaring Twenties, or whether it's kind of this world-weary, gritty tone of a war novel or something. And the right prose will come. The right prose will come to you if you're truthful with your writing, if you take the effort to not try to impersonate or copy what's popular or maybe what's easy or necessarily, or, if you try to copy your literary icons, which is something I've done, which is something that's very easy and tempting to do. Just try to be honest and find your prose that works for you, that works for your story, that works for the tone you want to capture. Because remember, the muse smiles on honesty. Thanks for listening to the Novel Analyst Podcast. Like I mentioned at the start of the episode, I'm making an effort to leave a quick review and kind of an analysis of every book I read this year on Goodreads. So if you would like to kind of get some extra novel analyzing content, check out my Goodreads page. I'm at Jed Hearn there. And you can follow along with the reviews of every book I've read. As I record this episode, I'm recording this halfway through February. I've written about 11-ish reviews so far this year, I think. Well, I've read 11 books. I'm pretty sure I've reviewed most of them. So you can go there and check it out and let me know what you think. I will see you next time.